England's newspaper industry was born near this spot 3 centuries ago. But we can't say that Fleet Street began here. After all, its printing presses had been running for more than 2 centuries by then. Up the road behind us, St. Paul's Cathedral, London's most famous landmark, was by then established as the centre of the British book trade, selling in its churchyard what came off those Fleet Street presses. Now, before we take a walk up Fleet Street, we'll have to cross the course of the old River Fleet, now running beneath ground before us here, and down to the River Thames at Blackfriars in the distance. Shakespeare had a theatre there for a time. Coming up on the other side of the street, King Henry VIII built his Bridewell Palace where that modern building is thrusting out. He preferred palaces to monasteries. And there, Fleet Street beckons. Note the 2 steeples, each one a church, the very centre of English publishing history. Let's look up the old course of the Fleet River, past where William the Conqueror built the notorious Fleet Prison, long gone now. As we cross Ludgate Circus, we are looking at the site where global tourism company Thomas Cook was launched almost 2 centuries ago. And once those buses clear off, you might notice the Punch Tavern, named for the famous satirical magazine that had its offices nearby. Straight ahead is something of a rarity, a plaque with a likeness of a Fleet Street worthy. Hundreds of worthies, only a handful of plaques. Its heartfelt inscription is worth a read. Dr. Samuel Johnson famously suggested that if you want a just notion of the magnitude of London, you must not be satisfied with seeing its great streets, but you must survey its innumerable little lanes and courts. We'll explore a few of them today. Of course, we will pass some pretty significant buildings along the way. Starting with this marvelous Art Deco construction, known by some in its heyday as the Black Lubyanka, and by its owners, the publishers of the Daily Express tabloid newspaper, as the Daily Express building. It has more recently been owned by Goldman Sachs, who moved from this spot up to the top of Shoe Lane here, which is actually much more famous for something that happened right here exactly 500 years ago. The fabulously named Wynkyn de Worde moved his printing operation here from Westminster, bringing with him a dedication to innovation and exploring what could be done on a printing press. We could say about this stretch of ground that here the world of commercial publishing really took off. Or, more precisely, the particular spot of ground we're approaching now if you cross-reference the old maps. Here we are, the site of the English-speaking world's first commercial printer. And so, the time flood onward rolls. Moving on, we come to another publishing palace, home to the Daily Telegraph, one of the country's older but still running broadsheet newspapers, albeit still running elsewhere now, like the rest of Fleet Street. Note the name by which the newspaper industry is still colloquially referred to by, let's say, older readers. Here comes witness to the connection between the printing and drinking industries. The old Cheshire cheese. Samuel Pepys grew up a few paces south of here, and Dr. Samuel Johnson compiled his dictionary just a few paces north. They, of course, were regulars. These people were not. Rather, the kings and queens of England, or at least as you see, the more recent ones, since the pub burned down in the Great Fire of London in 1666. Now, before we head up Wine Office Court, we'll see a number of plaques like this today. This one notes that while you and I might enjoy a drink in this pub, Charles Dickens, the king of Victorian novelists, operated out of it. Are you ready for this view? This alley is on the bucket list of every London tourist. Imagine all the famous footprints that we're tracking here from fiction as in real life. Trollope and Dickens were among the many who used this setting in their novels. And just about everyone who's ever picked up a pen or bashed a keyboard has walked up this alley. It's worth noting the time it took to rebuild this pub after the fire, a popular local then, as indeed it remains today. It is tempting to pop in for a pint, but we have a tour to get on with. While a pub crawl through history is a mouth-watering prospect in real life, online today we will focus on a court crawl, as there are half a dozen fabulous little alleys to explore between here and Fetter Lane. First of these is Bolt Court, where James Boswell tells us that he said his final goodbye to Dr. Johnson here at the entrance. But that is not the moment memorialized in this plaque. You'll see the small print suggests that we are marking the date of the launch of the Sun newspaper. But the headline notes the death 13 years after that of a pop star so famous that his last name is deemed unnecessary. Like so many kings, famous at his passing, and yet alone. A few yards further up the pavement, another court, another plaque, another wee anachronism. St. Dunstan's Court alerts us to the retreat of the printing presses before the new technologies at the end of the 1900s. Representing this white heat of innovation is an army of space invaders, techno-munchkins who themselves have since joined the ranks of posterity's curiosities. There's something to celebrate in Red Lion Court next, home to dozens of printers over the years, including the founder and popularizers of the Caslon family of typefaces that brought typography into the modern era. But of all today's lanes and courts, Crane Court offers up one of London's neater little historical gems, something not necessarily evident from its entrance here. This is where Sir Isaac Newton recited the world's oldest independent scientific academy in 1710. The Royal Society was to flourish here, at the end of this cul-de-sac, for 70 years, establishing the engine room of the English scientific enlightenment. Crane Court has its eminent publishing associations too, as Punch magazine and the Illustrated London News were launched in premises in this short alley. But it's the glory days of the Royal Society that leave the grandest glow. All that remains here of the Society today is this orb above the entrance to the court, a replica of the light that shone here whenever Society meetings were in session. It's off now, but it would have been shining when Society member Benjamin Franklin, the man of the key, the kite, and the American Declaration of Independence, published his famous paper on the electrical nature of lightning. Tracking back, out onto Fleet Street, we note El Vino's across the street, for decades known as the journalist's favorite wine bar. We're now approaching Fetter Lane, rich in its associations with London history and the legal profession. Now this junction is the site of one of London's most notorious gibbets, setting for the execution of so many who learned across 2 centuries that human life could be, in the words of Fetter Lane resident and philosopher Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. So perhaps we don't want to be hanging around here. C. Hoare and Company is a private bank that launched in the 17th century. When it expanded, years later it took over the site we see here of the more ancient Mitred Tavern, which survives today as inspiration for the Cradle of English podcast series, Mitre Nights. St. Dunstan in the West boasts association with dozens of the giants of English literature, from people who worked or worshipped here, John Donne, Samuel Pepys, to poets and playwrights who published here, going back to William Shakespeare himself. Now let's see if we can cross back without getting run over. Oops, and again. Now what might catch your eye at first is this bust of one of Fleet Street's great press barons, Lord Northcliffe. But then you look up at one of London's most famous clocks. You will lose track of the number of times this view is mentioned in novels and verse over the last couple of centuries. Also remarkable are the moving, giant figures that strike the bells on the hours and quarters. And to the right, that statue of Queen Elizabeth I was moved here a century ago after 2 centuries of standing out in the rain at Ludgate Circus, where our walk began. Resuming. While the church and the legal profession got an early start in Fleet Street, the banking and printing industries made up the ground quickly, and the pubs have always been here. Across the street here, you see. To the left of the Barclays Bank, you can see the old Cock Tavern, frequented by literature's great and good over several centuries, including that man Pepys again, also Alfred Lord Tennyson, Charles Dickens, and possibly a banker or two from next door. You might spot the sign of the 3 Squirrels of Gosling's Bank, now part of Barclays. Along with the other early banks, Hoare's we saw earlier, Gosling's emerged as a response to the explosion of printing following the restoration of the monarchy and the decade of plague and fire in the 1660s. These early banks, they deserve a walk and a video all their own. Chancery Lane is coming up on the right ahead now. 3 rather splendid monuments of Victorian architecture in quick succession. On the corner here, Attenborough and Son is one of London's premier jewellers. Then next door, the Old Bank of England, or more precisely its Law Courts branch, reflecting the significance of the legal profession to the world of banking, at least until the Old Bank closed in 1975 and reopened as a pub. Before we dwell on the magnificence of building number 3, let's pause to note one of a wee family of dragons of varying ferocity that can be found around the perimeter of the old city of London. Here, technically, is where Fleet Street ends and the Strand begins. Whatever signs say, these 150 yards as we track along the front of the Royal Courts of Justice are every bit as vital to the legacy of Fleet Street as any part of the road behind us. We are flanked here by the 4 famous Inns of Court, Inner and Middle Temple to the left of us, Lincoln's Inn and Gray's Inn to the right. If the Courts of Justice represent the beating heart of the English legal system, the Inns of Court are its lungs and guts. Every barrister belongs to one of them, is trained there, often practices there. Over 700 years, a huge community of support industries has arisen to service them, some 30 generations of printers, publishers, and the publicans, of course, and maybe an even older profession too. With a nod to Dr. Johnson, all that life can afford, and London, and England, and all of that life needs its laws. One last road crossing, possibly inevitably one last pub before we conclude our journey. It's probably just as inevitable that many of this pub's patrons over the years came here to discuss the strengths and the weaknesses of the English legal system. The George Tavern, celebrations of success, drownings of sorrows. And so we conclude. We reach our journey's end. Before us is St. Clement Danes, the church that Dr. Johnson attended. We see his statue looking over our shoulders and down Fleet Street towards St. Paul's Cathedral behind us. Much has changed in and around Dr. Johnson's old stamping ground in the centuries since he left us. But the English language he did so much to promote is more than ever associated with his lanes and courts, its spirit seeped into their stones.